are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision podcast. Derek Lambert here, and this is part 2 of an interesting show on the book Goy. Let me go ahead and introduce our guests. Ishay Rosen-Zvi is a full professor at Tel Aviv University, where he teaches rabbinic literature in the Department of Jewish Philosophy and Talmud. In 2013, he was elected to the Israel Young Academy of Sciences. He has written on Midrash and Mishnah, as well as on issues of self-formation and collective identity in Second Temple Judaism and rabbinic literature. Among his publications are Demonic Desires, Yetzer Hara, and the Problem of Evil in Late Antiquity, Body and Soul in Ancient Judaism, the Mishnaic Sotah Ritual, Temple Gender and Midrash, Between Mishnah and Midrash, The Birth of Rabbinic Literature, and the topic of today's discussion, a book from 2018 entitled Goy, Israel's Others and the Birth of the Gentile, co-authored with our guest, Adi Ophir. And he is a professor of emeritus at Tel Aviv University, where he teaches at the program for Middle East Studies. He also directs the project Political Concepts at Brown at, correct me if I'm wrong, Kogut Institute for the Humanities. His books include Divine Violence, 2 essays on God and Disaster, and The Order of Evils. They've also co-authored 42-page article for the Jewish Quarterly Review. Go down in the description. It was written in 2015, and it predated the book by a few years, Paul and the Invention of the Gentiles. Make sure you guys check that out. So I want to go ahead and dig into the show here, ladies and gentlemen. Last show, we talked about or briefly, passages in Genesis where the offspring of Abraham and Ephraim are prophesied to become multitude of nations. And Paul applies these prophecies to his Gentile audience using similar language, the fullness of the nations, in Romans chapter 11. We were talking and tried to avoid Paul because Paul himself and the rabbis deserve their own episode. And we're thankful to have you guests join us again. So welcome to 2021 on MythVision. That's my introduction to say welcome.
Thank you.
Yes. You've seen the template. Okay. I've sent you guys the template. My friend Steven came up with some wonderful graphics I'd like to pull up on the screen while we go. But Paul is doing something very interesting, and I figure we could dive into what he's doing as we go. We've got enough in the template to cover the show, but I do want to mention some interesting things you guys bring up about Paul throughout this episode. And maybe you guys will automatically do it and I don't have to bring it up, because I really want to say up front before we start, get the book. You will not regret it. I'm telling you, if you want to be educated in seeing with a magnifying glass how complex these texts, plural, are, and the ideas of who the Goy are, the Gentiles, the nations, what's going on here, you got to read the book, or else you're just going to be in the dark. So thank you so much, guys. I really do appreciate you joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Genesis 17, 4-7. You guys, I'm going to pull this up, and I want your honest opinion. What's going on here as we go? Because I'm just a student. I've got a lot to learn, and I figure why not have you guys tell me what you've learned on these things, because I've learned so much from your book. I know I can really learn now. Here we go. Let me know if you see it. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
What's going on here in terms of maybe bringing Paul into the picture? And I guess I don't even really have to ask a question, because this is your playground and I'm joining your playground.
Yeah. Listen, Derek, we have to discuss, Genesis on its own term, and then Paul on its own term, and not assume that Paul somehow, trick us or fake Genesis. He's a reader, and that's what ancient readers and also modern readers do, right? They interpret and reinterpret, and they move stuff from one context to another, and that's perfectly okay. That's what readers do. So if we talk about Genesis, that's a totally, common blessing of, offspring, multiplicity, and that's the biblical type of blessings, because there is no world to come in the Bible, right? What the righteous get is offspring, continuity, right? And the more the merrier. And so that's a perfectly regular, Genesis-like blessing for the forefathers. Because remember, we are speaking about the forefathers, and the assumption is that the whole world came from them, right? So you have to explain how these, several families became this multitude of nations, right? So you're both reading forward how they became and backwards where did we come from and where did all these nations come from, right? So that's about Genesis. Now we can move to Galatians, but maybe Adi wants to add something about Genesis.
No, I just want to stress, because this is important for the comparison between the two texts, to stress the fact that Genesis is about offsprings, literal offsprings, the son and the son of the son, etc., etc. And it is taking place in a moment in which Abraham is still doesn't have a son from his wife, and this is what he's worried about. He wants a son from his wife, not from his mistress. So it is really we must understand Genesis. We must understand the critical importance of the biological aspect of this genealogy, and then we can see what Paul is doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's the politics of offspring, of continuity, and then Paul take it to a different context, because that's what he does. Paul is a apostle to the ethne. That's his mission. That's his call. That's his job description, right? Now he is using all kinds of biblical sources in order to plant these ethne into the biblical story, right? Because for him, look, his story is basically the traditional Judean, story of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? He's not speaking about a universal human being, not even in the Philonic kind of, allegorical manner. He's thinking through the Bible and through Genesis and through the story of the holy nation. And yet he has to plant them somehow in. That's a very, complicated mission. So he's using all kinds of scriptural, techniques, midrashic, interpretive technique in order to, and this is one of them, reading the ethne, the goyim, as Gentiles, is a kind of what Adi and I call privatization or individuation, right? Meaning, translating these political units, nations, collective, into these individuals that he is approaching and telling them, look, what the Bible says, what this verse says, these are you. You are these nations. So you are the offspring of Abraham. So that's a very sophisticated interpretive technique of, letting them in.
There is, it is even more radical than it, and it's very. The passage captures a lot of levels of his intervention. So what he does here is actually creating a new historical narrative that enables two things at once. One, on the one hand, it enables the inclusion of the non-Jews into the election, into the covenant with the Israel God, without joining Israel. They are coming without joining Israel. At the same time, he's not telling the Israelites, you are no longer important. No, The history of the covenants in the plural of God with the Israelites is crucial. This is the sacred history. This is the sacred version of history, and it is kept. So, unlike other interpreters of the time that took a distance from the biblical text by allegorizing it and creates simply a distinction between two layers. So here's the literal meaning and here's the allegorical meaning. Here is the flesh and here is the spirit, and they are separate. What Paul does, he creates a system in which there is an allegorical meaning, but it is part of a whole system. So the two parts remain encapsulated in one system. You must maintain the flesh, not only as a negated element, but as part of your history. If you join the ecclesia, it becomes part of your history, the history of the flesh.
I thought that was fascinating, and I'm not trying to skip ahead, but this is amazing. They still remain ethne even after joining. They don't literally become Israelites, and
right.
And that goes into a concept of conversion, that people could convert. And why not? Why didn't he make them convert? So this is a big question. I love what you're saying here, because you go into the 2nd century just a little and mention how the church fathers take kind of what Paul's saying, but they really they're not taking what Paul's saying. You explain it well. Like, he keeps the ethnic, retains some of that, but also is opening up a door for things that later ends up becoming the priority. And then, of course, Christianity and then heathens becomes the new dichotomy for the Christians. So it's
Eric, can I add one thing about the importance of the flesh and the carnal lineage? You know, Paul uses the word allegory once when he speaks about Sarah and Hagar, right? In the allegory of Sarah and Hagar in Galatians 4. So you might expect that there it will be all spiritual, right? That you are like Isaac, you are like Abraham's, but that's not how this allegory ends. It ends with the idea of genealogy, of actual genealogy. You are the children of Isaac. So it's clear that Paul cannot be satisfied with the idea of allegory, of being similar to, of being like, okay? He needs an actual genealogy. Now, of course, from the perspective of the history of Christianity, this is fascinating because Paul is considered to be the father of allegory, right? Origen says, you know, I've learned allegory from Paul. But Paul uses allegory only once, and even then, he insists that this is about real genealogy rather than just likeness.
Okay, so that brings we're getting off script a little.
I just want to add a word about what bothered you about the people who claim that the ethne are actually Israelites. In order to maintain such a claim, it's not enough to take just one verse. You have to explain with this interpretation a whole set of relations in the text, and I think that if you try to do it, it runs counter to what Paul says in many other things. When we read it in our way, it's never about one particular verse. You know, there are many verses that fall now into place, into a system that or a structure that makes sense of them, and that runs throughout the corpus, the Pauline corpus. So for example, flesh and spirit are related in a very specific way to the distinction between Jew and Gentile, and of course some of the other and some other distinctions or concepts simply lose their importance, like Greek and barbarian. They are used, but they are no longer important. They are used as a model. Everyone knows what Greek and barbarian means and what the opposition means. But these are no longer important. If you say in the ecclesia you can be either Greek or barbarian, then who should care about whether you are one or the other?
Interesting. So, okay, we're going to keep continuing because we're going to touch things as we go. This is so good. Real quick on the Ephraim context, I just want to ask you guys, because this is, we're going to leave that here in just a second. Ephraim in the original context in Genesis, he is supposed to be a fullness of nations. There's going to be like a multitude of nations, if that's a better literal way of phrasing it in the Hebrew. A multitude of nations, but because the expectation was that all of Jacob's descendants, literally from Genesis, including Jacob and Ephraim, would be ethnic Israelites, not foreign non-Israelite nations. Or was this inspired by Assyrian crisis that dispersed the northern tribes into the foreign nations? So I guess this is a bad question to ask, but I guess we're projecting the future from the narrative of the exile of the northern kingdom back into Ephraim's narrative and saying you'll be a multitude of nations because they got scattered into the nations. That's also kind of doing what Paul's doing, right?
Well, in a way, I mean that's a very good point. That when the narrator tells this blessing about Ephraim, and Joseph, the narrator already knows the history, right? And it's right. It's post it's post the destruction of Samaria and the exile, and so you're right. The narrator is probably projecting back the story of Ephraim, and so the fullness of etne melo goyim could be read as as in a weak sense of he'll be everywhere, okay, and it could be read in a stronger way. But you're right. I mean, this reinterpretation is an ongoing process. What Paul does is use all these different idioms and terms, right, in order to do the one thing that he's obsessed with, and this letting them in. And I want to add another term here. At the same period, there is a group in Qumran, right near the Dead Sea, that is doing something pretty similar, meaning using scripture, okay, in order to legitimize their revolutionary, way of life and their revolutionary concept of history. And they call this technique pesher. Pesher meaning to read these verses, okay, concretely about themselves and in their specific period, which they believe is close to the end of days, etc. Okay, so they knew, how to take all kinds of verses and say, this is about us. These prophecies and these blessings and this, this is specifically about us. So what we argue basically is that Paul is doing a similar kind of pesher and telling these, ethne, these blessings are about you. All you have to do is to read ethne as Gentiles, okay, meaning in an individualized way, and here you have it. You have the whole story. The door is open and you're let in, okay? But what we have to be cautious, from is to assume that Paul has one model, one narrative, because he's using all kinds of verses and all kinds of models in order to let them in. So, so he's using the idea of, sperma Abraham, right? The children of Abraham. And sometimes it seems that they are adopted children. right? Because they get the status of children, right? He called them, right? But sometimes it seems like they are actual offspring, and sometimes they are like Isaac. Sometimes they are from Isaac, and sometimes they are from the multitude of ethne, right? Hamon goyim. But you can't be at the same time from Isaac and from the multitude of ethne. So what does he do? He uses all these different tracks in order to let them in. So Ephraim may well be, one more track to let them in. So we have to see it as, a series of interpretive techniques that he used.
Oh, I'm sorry, Adi,
right? He used the metaphor of planting in order to plant them into the sacred history of Israel.
Adi?
So these are all interpretive techniques, but they're also rhetorical techniques. They are supposed to lure the audience, to get them into the story, to get them to listen in the first place, to get them to read the letter in the first place. Now, there is one thing which is really incredible in this, is that he's writing a letter to a community of people who lives in Rome. So, if you live in Rome, you're a Roman, right? He never calls them Romans. He never calls them by the name they call themselves, probably. Maybe they call themselves members of the ecclesia or followers of Christ or something like this. So he uses this also, but it's when he tells them, "I speak to you Gentiles, I speak to ethne," he is not only addressing them; he tells them who they are. He brand them anew. Actually, this is already a moment in their conversion. They are no longer identified by the way their neighbors identify them. They are identified by the name or the label that would allow them to become part of the new ecclesia, because they cannot be part of the new ecclesia as followers of an ethnic god. In a straightforward manner. They are not Israelites. They are not Jews.
This gets into something I do want to get into, is how gods were ethnic. Also, not only were they ethnic and the people were ethnic to the gods, but also the land. But I guess one question in this whole thing is, like, since Paul keeps hijacking and giving these rhetorical and linguistic ways of entering the ethne, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate, isn't it easier just to assume, hey, he says they're like Jacob, he says they are Jacob, he says they're like children of Abraham, he says they are children of Abraham. Isn't it easier just to say, well, they really were literally children of Abraham, and Paul's just finding a way to make these ethne become? But the problem with that, while I say that question, why didn't he just circumcise them? If they were children of Abraham, why didn't he just, you know what I'm saying? Like, why didn't he just say, come on in and, you're just like Jews because you're ethnic descendants of Abraham. You might as well get under the Torah, but he doesn't do that. So I guess I'm answering somewhat while asking a question, but if you don't mind, can you explain that?
Before Adi answers, I want to radicalize the question, because, his opponents did exactly that, right? The rival missionaries came to these Galatians and told them, we are also Jesus followers, and all the things that Paul told you are right. But, let's make it easier. Let's make it easier. All you have to do is to circumcise, and then all the blessings will follow. So the question is not only why Paul does not demand circumcision, but why he does not allow for circumcision. Why does he care?
Do you want to answer this? So, Isha, do you want to answer the question? No, go ahead. Answer.
No, it's for you.
I'd love to hear you guys, yeah.
So he cannot allow circumcision, because allowing circumcision would be making circumcision an essential part of one's identity. That's again, you remain in the flesh. It's not open for the spirit. It's the whole mechanism of inclusivity would collapse. It will be, a small community of people who it's not a small matter to circumcise when you are 25 or something. When you hear the message at first, it's a big price to pay. So there is this practical aspect, and then there is the metaphysical or the theological aspect, because this will connect you and leave you stuck in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant. What is the meaning of the New Covenant, of the new relationship between God and humanity, if we are still stuck in the election of this one people, if we are still stuck in the law? So the construction, as I said before, it also the terms and oppositions are related to each other. So circumcision means that you are still follow the law, that the law is the crucial element in practicing the new relation to God. But if it's so, what's new about it? That's old. The new covenant and the New Testament comes with faith versus law. So if you demand circumcision, you diminish the importance of this opposition, and with it, the entire system actually would collapse.
Absolutely. Let me add a few things that Adi kind of hinted to. First, you can look at it, and when Adi said it's not a small thing to circumcise, you can look at it from a kind of utilitarian point of view, right? Had Paul, kept this demand of circumcision, of course, the community could not become what it became when he opened the door. But I don't think it was, we don't think it was just, about, kind of the sociological or the social point of view. He thinks with the Bible. And for the book of Genesis, circumcision is not just an act, it's the covenant, right? And so it's Genesis 17. And so to let the circumcision in is to let the old story in. And so Paul is very meticulous about what he allows, as part of the story and what he doesn't. And that's also connected to what Adi spoke earlier about, Paul, this sensitive guy being everything to everyone. How could he approach the Romans as Romans, right? That's what they are. They're very proud about their heritage, living in the, center of the universe. So how could he fail? He didn't approach them as Romans even once, right? Because he wants to teach them that being Roman is meaningless, theologically speaking, because he's not, he's telling them the story that matters. So being Roman does not matter. He approached them as ethnic. He says as much in the beginning of the epistle. You are ethnic. So he teaches them their way in. And it's the same with circumcision. If he let them keep, this threshold, then he adopts the old story.
He doesn't stop.
Ridiculous.
He doesn't stop Jews, though. You know what I'm saying? So it doesn't appear, at least, he's stopping Jews.
Because Jews do not have to be let in.
Right.
They're already part of the story. And he is now narrating the new story for the new ecclesia. Okay, and he has, when we think about Paul's innovativeness and radicalism, we have to remember, what are we talking about? We're talking about a few hundreds, people scattered in several, tiny communities. And yet Paul can envision an ecclesia tuteu, a community, a church of God, right? And he can speak about Jews and Greeks and ecclesia tuteu, as if these are three, parallel groups, although we're talking about tiny communities that he knows by name, right?
Right.
He at the end of Romans, he sends regards, right, to basically all the members of the community. So he really envisions, his story is a metaphysical story. It's not just a actual social. It's a metaphysical story, and in this story, Romans have no place, and circumcision has no place.
Interesting. Do you want me to go ahead and move forward?
Move forward.
Cool. Okay. So Dr. Jason Staples, which he's got a book coming out soon. It's on pre-order. I'm looking forward to seeing what he says. Here are some excerpts from Jason Staples' article in the section, The Fullness of the Nations, Paul's Mystery Revealed. So we're focused on Paul. The Gentiles now receive the Spirit are a fulfillment of Jacob's prophecy. They're Ephraim's seed. They are Israel, restored through the new covenant. God had planned all along that Ephraim's seed would become the fullness of the nations, so that when Ephraim was restored, it would result also in the redemption of the Gentiles in Abraham's seed. The fullness of the Gentiles refer to the ingathering of the Gentiles into Israel, but their new identity as reconstituted Ephraim, Paul is simultaneously proclaiming the salvation of the Gentiles and the return of the northern kingdom as the same event. Jeremiah 31 calls for Ephraim to return from among the nations. This, despite Jeremiah's recognition that Ephraim is no more, it is in this context that the new covenant is promised with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And so here's a visual, and maybe you guys can comment on this here.
Look, listen, that's that's a nice thing, and I know it's very important for you, and
right.
You can maybe explain why. But for us, it's it's a possible reading. Paul is using so many biblical allusions, so it's always a question how much to how much to assume that he drags from the Bible with these allusions. So Staples here is assuming the maximal possibility that with these allusion to the fullness of the ethne, Paul took the whole story of Ephraim. Now that's I can't that's a possibility. What we will insist is that even if this story, if we accept this story, in its wholeness, and that's I see no reason why to reject it. It's one of the interpretive and rhetorical techniques that Paul is using, and it's side by side rather than instead his story about Isaac and his story about the father of many nations and his story about the adopted children. All these stories live in his meta narrative of the apostle to the Gentiles side by side.
May I say something, Adi? Because I'd love to have your thoughts. I just wanted to say, this is amazing what you're saying, because Jason is technically taking Paul's word on it. You know what I mean? Like he in his view is accepting the full maximum of what Paul is trying to do. Whereas what you're saying is you're trying to go behind the scenes and say, yeah, he's probably using those narratives, but for a purpose toward his individual Gentiles. And that's the power of what your book brings to the table. This is not a collective political binary structure between nations, politically speaking, and Israel, politically speaking. We're talking about Joe and Sally and Bob, Mr. Greek pagan, Mr. Phoenician woman, Mr. like just the different specific individuals, which is the drive of your book is really showing Paul's innovative thought on the individualistic gentility of these people and them being included into the covenant of Israel. But I got to ask a question. I got to ask.
Okay.
Galatians chapter 3, Paul talks about them becoming children of Abraham by faith. It's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, and this is kind of a theological interpretive thing because Paul does this. It sounds like Paul's making them by faith in the seed, singular, Jesus. By having faith in him, they now become children of Abraham. That's been my understanding, but some people want to say, no, they were already children of Abraham, but just because you're a descendant of Abraham doesn't mean you're really of Israel, Romans chapter 9. And they want to make Romans chapter 9 and Galatians 3 combine, where these are actual descendants and so forth. So it sounds like these ethne, these individual Gentiles that he's talking to, were not really Israelites, and he's making them able to come in. Is that what he's doing in Galatians 3?
I think so. I mean, if I had to choose between these readings, I would meaning that, he let the ethne in regardless of their actual, genealogy. That's the whole idea, that the actual genealogy is meaningless.
Wow.
And this is where the distinction between faith and law comes in. So they will be saved by faith and not by following the law. So we have actually here, with the individuation of the many Gentiles and the erasure of the particular nations, and so you have one, Gentiles is a general term to describe everyone who is not a Jew, and Gentile has no meaning except for the negation of being a Jew. So beyond this, where we have content, it's not in the term itself, Gentile, Jew, but in the fact that on the one hand, you have a community of the law, a community whose relation to God is mediated by the law, and all the rest, which is in potentially humanity at large, is a community whose relation to God is mediated by faith, and this is the real radical moment. Because this allows the expansion, the exponential expansion of the new system, of the new religious, if you could call it religious. And this is also why later the importance of Gentile is diminished, because Gentile for Paul is a conversional moment. It's good for the moment of conversion for a small community that was really a minor community that would like to expand and become large. Once Christians become hegemonic in the cultures in which they live, they don't need it anymore. Now there are two new oppositions, one between Christians and Jews. So Christianity and Judaism become a new opposition. It wasn't like this before. In Paul, it's not the opposition between Christian and Jews. It's opposition between Jews and something else that is in between the Gentile. And so this is one opposition in the new phase, and the other is between Christians and Hittian or pagans. Mm-hmm. So those who are already in and those who are still inside. You have two others there. Those who have not yet made the choice, and those who could have made the choice and refused, the Jews. So, and in this constellation, you don't need Gentiles.
Yeah, so actually in the book, we show that already in the 2nd century CE, right? In Justin Martyr and others, they almost do not use the concept of ethnic. They use it when they use the Bible, when they quote Paul, but they don't need it as a concept because they see themselves now as Christians and as Verus Israel, as the real Israel.
Right.
So it's really we really have to see it in a context of a specific situation that Paul needed this techniques in order to tell his story. And I want to add one thing that I think we cannot ignore, and that's the issue of gender, because his communities were mixed, right, from men and women. It's clear from the regards he sent at the end of Romans and from his in 1 Corinthians when he speak about the ethics of the community and who can speak and who cannot. But of course he ignores women when he talks about circumcision because he thinks with the androcentric logic of the Bible that offspring is through, right? It's through men. And the issue of sperm is what constitutes genealogy. So again, he sees what he sees through his biblical, glasses.
And that creates problems for him, though. That creates problems for Paul. And the logical conclusions Paul's trying to make, because you pointed out before we hit record, this causes contradictions. Him trying to create this new thing and trying to develop this new idea. It's a revolutionary idea. And in fact, in modern terms, we would appreciate someone like Paul who's trying to, I guess you'd say, try to not keep division amongst ethnic gods and things. He's trying to be cosmopolitan. And his God is becoming more and more cosmopolitan, but that was already something that you mentioned in the book. Late prophets and other writings, Jews were already doing that. Hellenistic Jews were already broadening the scope of their God. But this creates problems for Paul. What you said in the before we hit the record button. Are there some examples you could give us of off the top of your head that are just some issues you find that Paul is wrestling with that he contradicts himself on?
Oh, he contradicts himself many times, and I believe, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's because he's a creative thinker, and he's going back and forth. Think about Romans 7 when he, says, the nomos, the law, right, cannot save us from sin, but can only generate sin. And then he stops and say, does this mean that the law is bad? Right? Oh, no, meganoito. No, that cannot possibly be. And then he creates all this distinction between the nomos, which is spiritual, and us who are carnal. And so there's a kind of, mismatch between us and the law. And scholars, scratch their heads and ask, but in Galatians, he's much more critical of the law than in Romans. And in 1 Corinthians, he's much more positive because the context changed, right? And he's polemical, right? His polemical context changed. And so he's negotiating. He's negotiating because he has this ultimate goal. It's not a goal that for him, it's his, definition of who he is, and in order to fulfill this goal, he's willing to make all these different negotiations and with scripture, with his audience, with his tradition, with himself. So yeah, for us, it's a badge of honor to contradict yourself.
I would like to add to this something.
Yeah,
there are other tensions, I would say, that are not only related to different circumstances and creativity and the dynamic of the development of the epistolary corpus. So I would like to give two examples. One is between a statement like you are Gentile and the statement like you were Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
So are they Gentiles or are they still Gentile or no longer Gentiles? But this is not simply, it is not exactly a contradiction, but it is an expression of the liminal status of gentility. So gentility, you have to say, right? Because it is a transitional stage, you become a Gentile once you recognize yourself as called by the gospel and addressed by the messenger. You can be an addressee only if you become a Gentile and forget about your Roman identity or whatever. But once you join the ecclesia, Gentile and Jews these are oppositions that make no more sense. You stay in your gentility, but you are no longer a Gentile because vis-a-vis Christ, everyone is the same. So the two coexist. The past and the present coexist in a very strange way, always anticipating the future redemption, in which everyone is equal. So this is one example. Another is related to the revocation of the calling. So he says, well, think about yourself. Yes, you are still a man, you are still a woman, you are a slave, you are a master. You stay in your calling in the way you were called. This is Corinthian, I forgot the 7, I think. It's 1 Corinthians 7. Stay in your calling. But these are nothing. They are act as if you were not. You are a master, but you should think about yourself as if you are not. Because, again, vis-a-vis Christ, all these divisions are nothing. But, and he also says that God is never, the callings of God, this is the condition in which you were called, like circumcised, uncircumcised, cannot be revoked because this is how God makes it. God doesn't change his mind. But if you think about yourself as the priest in the temple of Zeus, can you still be a priest in the temple of Zeus and join the ecclesia? If you think about yourself in the practice, in the pagan practice, worshiping some other gods, this is what you were in your previous life, and now you want to join the ecclesia? God must change his mind. And on this, he's silent.
That's interesting.
Because he chooses very carefully the categories that are in this game of what can be and what should not be revoked, and is very silent on all the others. And this is part of how he creates the neutrality of the Gentile.
I think that's powerful because you mentioned in your book that Paul makes a reference about a man who takes his father's wife. And he's like, not even the ethne do this, but you're also calling the holy ones, your holy ones, ethne. So it's almost like there's two ethne, and he means something different in the context, depending on what he's using it for. So that's powerful that you can see. I mean, the same word, like with my old fundamentalist thinking and a lot of the friends I talk to, they have this, like, if the Greek word says ethne here and it says ethne there, it's like they know context is supposed to matter, but I don't think they can see past. They don't know enough of the linguistic, the syntax, the kind of understanding, like the language enough to be able to see that they mean different things. If it looks the same, It is the same. And that's a problem with not being educated, which is why I refer to experts to give me their thoughts. It doesn't mean everything you say is true or right, but it's a great place to start and ask the experts, like, why do you think this way? So I'm going to continue if that's okay with you guys. Okay, because the English translation challenges. This is an important one. In 1996, the issue of the Chicago Society of Biblical Research by James LeGrand, entitled Proliferation of the Gentile in the New Revised Standard Version, which according to Bauer's Greek lexicon argues against use of Gentiles as a rendering of ethne. It's fairly easy to come up with examples where when you line up in different translations of the term in question, some translations like the NRSV have Gentiles while others have nations. This is especially true when comparing quotations of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament. Some of the key examples are those that refer to descendants of Abraham as nations. In translations of Romans 15, 8 through 12, where translations often replace the Hebrew Bible's nations with Gentiles through Paul's quotations. And I'll go ahead and share the screen. So can we address that one?
Yeah, sure. Listen, Romans 15 is a great example of his innovative usage of scripture, because what does he do there? He take these verses that speak about Israelite or his people, okay, versus the ethnic, right, the goyim. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly, Paul knows that when the ethnic are juxtaposed with his people, it's about the collectives. It's nations, but he is translating these verses to refer to his communities, right? He tells them these nations that will rejoice with his people, these are you, okay? So what Psalms say, okay, that, or what Samuel says, or what Deuteronomy says, rejoice you nation with his people, this applies to you. So the question of translation here is whether we want to preserve the biblical meaning or the new meaning that Paul, mm-hmm. right, that Paul is struggling to inject into this verse. But Paul himself, I would say, used both, because he wants to keep the connection to the biblical heritage, right? And yet, in a kind of pesher-like, Qumranic-like way, right, to make it apply to his new community. So I would say he's playing exactly in this space between these two meanings. Because if he does not keep the political meaning, he loses the connection to the verses.
And if you and no translation can be perfect, but a translation that would keep the sense of the transition, the effort to go from one context of meaning to another context. This is the only translation that would do justice to the text, because we see here an actual effort to change the meaning of a term.
If I may ask you, gentlemen, an example, Deuteronomy 32:43, if we were to forget Paul for a second and just go to Deuteronomy 32:43, it seems to me, unless I have convoluted glasses on, I'm forcing something that isn't there, that with his people, that's Israel, the nation, yes. And the nations are others that are not Israelites that are supposed to rejoice with Israel.
Yeah, that's right. In this context, this is perfect. But you know that Israel could be called a goy.
Yes.
In the Bible. Yes.
So that's important too that you just said that, because usually they're called a holy goy, but
not always. Not always. They can be goy, just goy.
Okay, and so there are people who want to slip in that and say, well, if Israel can be called goy, You know what that means. That means when you see Goy and Paul.
But I think this is it's an important remark that the people who read the Bible in this way assume something which we reject from the very beginning because we are historians. They assume that there was a meaning to the text, and this meaning may be lost. But there is one meaning to the word, and it applies everywhere in the same way, and it should be restored. And we know that this is not true because we see how meanings change all the time. This is language. Language is a living being. It cannot retain the old meaning forever.
Well said. Ishay, would you like to comment on that? That was very well said.
I think that's a great example. The Deuteronomy 32:43 is a great example again of Paul interpretive effort to use, and he's like picking very meticulously all these verses that speak about the goyim, right, as joining, right, as rejoicing with, okay, and all these parallelism between, because it's not only about the meaning, it's also about the structure. He takes all these verses that use parallelism between his people and the ethne, and use them in order to let them in. So you see how persistent he is with, but he's also in this specific place in Romans 15, I would say that he kind of reveals, his cards, reveals his tricks.
Yeah. Because
otherwise, if he wanted to hide the translational effort, he wouldn't bring these verses that use this parallel between his people and the ethnic, because that's kind of that's called a trick. But what he does is exactly this kind of Qumranic passion. He's telling you are the new addressees of these. And why are you the new addressees? Because the time comes. So we didn't talk about eschatology, but eschatology is a very important part of this story. As Paula Friedrichsen says, the time in God's watch, right? The time in God's watch. Since the time has come, therefore, now this is the suitable reading. It was not the suitable reading, maybe, 20 years ago, but now it is.
That's very well said. Okay. And I think Paul does the same thing in Romans 9-11 when he quotes all of these passages. You will leave us a remnant, a seed. You will do this, you will do that. Like he's doing this same Pesher stuff. And you know what's interesting? I wanted to bring to your attention, because I'm sure you guys have seen this. We have great scholars like Dr. Staples, Paula Fredrickson, Dr. Fredrickson, and others who they don't agree on everything. Paula Fredrickson says these are ex-pagan pagans. Dr. Staples agrees they're pagans, but they're kind of like fitting this, both the northern Israel kingdom, but also nations, plural, in the political sense in some way. And so this is interesting because Paul's doing whatever he has to do to make all of these passages, and he does show his cards in Romans 15. He's using clear passages that make a dichotomy between Israel and other nations, and then applies it to his ethne here in Romans 15. So if Romans 11's ethne were literally Israel, he wouldn't be quoting, the passages referring to the ethne that he has. You see, like it's a contradiction if you try to apply it that way. Anyway, that I had to mention that. That's an interesting point.
But you already know that we like contradictions. So
yes, sir. I'm going to show you guys something, and this is actually my friend who loves scholarship. He's asked this question, and we've never had anyone like address it on the air. And you guys being scholars in the field have probably heard of this. There is a well-known textual variant in Deuteronomy 32:43, which we were just reading about. Paul uses these passages, where a Dead Sea Scroll and the Septuagint agree against the Masoretic. But it has one line in red, as you guys see, where the MT, the Masoretic, and the LXX agree against the Dead Sea Scrolls. Your article states the following about this verse. These verses explicitly equate Gentiles, or goyim, ethne, with peoples, nations, amim. How is it low? How do you pronounce the Laoi?
Leom.
Leom.
Okay. Is it?
I'm not sure. Again, how do you
Laoi?
Laos?
Laos.
Yeah.
The nations. Laos.
Yes. Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. Praise the Lord, all Gentiles, and let all the peoples praise him. By citing these specific verses, Paul thus discloses the biblical ethnic origin of the term and highlights its semantic shift. And thus the old meaning of Gentiles as peoples does not appear altogether. It is still encapsulated in the word ethne, which we've already talked about this, but articulating the recognition that the effort to overcome ethnic markers occurs in a world that remains ethnic and is populated by ethnic gods. So in this passage, do you have any take on this? I guess you could call it a discrepancy going on, or textual variant.
Yeah, look, the textual variants are not, very rare. We tend to think about the Bible, from a kind of canonical point of view, but we know from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and from comparing the Septuagint to the Masoretic text, that there are all kinds of versions, and clearly, heavens and nations in Hebrew graphically are very similar. Goyim and Shamayim are almost identical graphically. So there were different versions. That's not the exciting things here. The exciting thing is the way Paul uses the verse, okay, in order to make his point. And that's the bold move here, right? Using these verses about the nations and his people in order to make his point. But as we said, he used whatever he got, okay, in order to bring the point home that, you, according to the Bible's own story, you are now let in.
Mm-hmm. And
I just want to say, he uses whatever he got from the Bible. We have to remember this. And not for anywhere else.
He uses also different versions. He sometimes uses the Septuagint version. He sometimes uses the Hebrew version because he knows both. And so he can, take advantage of the different version if it suits his cause.
He's a sneaky guy. He's a sneaky guy. I just must say.
He's a reader. He's an ancient reader. And that's what ancient readers do.
I would like to add something to his descriptions. You called him a radical, revolutionary, sneaky, whatever. In my jargon, I would call him a generator of a new discourse. And this is a rare phenomenon that a single individual can be credited with generating a new discourse, because discourse is usually an accumulation of mutations that somehow conglomerate into a new structure, and many people participate in it. And the mark of an individual in this process is usually inflated, because so many people contribute to it. But there are moments in history where you can see something like this. So Marx, for example, is a generator. Karl Marx, if I can mention his name alongside Paul, I hope it's not a blasphemy. Another radical Jew. So he is a generator of a new discourse, Marx's discourse. You can say that Freud is someone like this with his psychoanalysis. Paul is one of these few. If we move for a moment just to the rabbis, first, second century rabbis, there you must speak about many people. It's not a single individual who initiated this kind of new discourse that we describe in the book. It's really a whole community. Everyone contributed something, and then gradually at a certain moment we see, well, there is something really radically different than what was before. But there is no moment where we can say, here, this man is responsible for it.
Interesting. So gods are ethnic. So I'm going to focus on this for a second, because this is, and Paula Fredrickson spends a lot of time talking about this in her lectures. The God of Israel is Israel's God. It's an ethnic God. And I must say, before I continue, that like you can become part of Israel according to certain contexts within the Hebrew scriptures by becoming circumcised and joining covenant with Israel, and the promises and all of these things are now applied to you. But it is, you had to become Israel to be able to ultimately have those covenants and be in covenant with the God of Israel. Some God-fearers from a distance would go dabble with Zeus and Apollo and all these gods, and then come and they'd worship Yahweh from a distance. If it's okay that I say his name, I don't mean any disrespect by saying God's name, because I know that Jews do have some Jews, yes, and so I'm careful. You guys are more scholarly and open-minded to documentary hypothesis and things like that, so that I didn't know. The gods are ethnic, which would mean it doesn't just work one way. It's not just Israel. It's like everyone else has the same thing. Paul's tearing down this wall. And so I wanted to mention a few scholars that attempt to solve the paradox by using the Roman concept of adoption. The Gentile believers become an adopted sons of Abraham, or offer other categories or metaphors of hybridity, such as a third race, E.P. Sanders, honorary Jews, Krister Stendahl, ex-pagan pagans, which I always thought was interesting when she said that, Paula Fredrickson, the lost tribes of Israel, Dr. Jason Staples, or even Gentile Jews, Joshua Garraway. These definitions only name the paradox. They do not explain why it's necessary in the first place. Would you guys like to give us, out of those scholars, in your estimation, who's closest to No,
but we believe that they're all kind of circling the same, paradox, the same problem. And the only distinction between them and us is that we celebrate this paradox, meaning they try to carve a place and to say, well, it's very strange because they're neither here nor there, right? And we say, yes, exactly. They're neither here nor there. And that's what Paul invents. He carved this in-between place, right? Between the pagans and the Israelite, okay? And that's his idea of gentility, okay? Wow. Gentility is their way in. Okay, being ethnic, coming as ethnic is the way, because they can't come as Israelite because they're not circumcised, right? And they can't come as just general human beings because he wants to keep this sacred story of election, right?
Right.
So the trick he comes with is that they will come as ethnic. And so Gentiles is exactly for him this category of in between, and that's why it was not preserved, right? Because once they're in, they didn't need it, anymore. So they don't see themselves as ethnic, right? They see themselves now as, from the beginning of second century as Christianoi, as Christians, right? And so we kind of embrace this paradox and say, yes, this is exactly the Paul's innovation in order to A, let them in, B, keep the sacred story, and C, and that's something very important that we didn't emphasize enough, and C, preserve the Israelites intact as a group. So because he wants to keep the Israelites, because without the Israelites, he doesn't have a story.
Mm. And Adi is an expert with the philosophy, so I know that helped in trying to wrap your head around a paradox, because philosophy is perfect for this. So would you like to elaborate on some of that as well?
No, I think that Ishay said it well. I mean, there's nothing really philosophical here. I would say it's an analysis of discourse, and it is an attempt to understand, not to solve the paradox, but to reconstruct the way that what seems to us paradoxical actually works in creating new meanings in the story, and in creating new possibilities. And this is exactly what Ishay described now.
Interesting. That was.
Would you say that paradoxes are necessary for what you call the generator of a new discourse?
Not necessarily. I don't think that there is a general algorithm for if we had
between the old and the new.
But not everyone is committed to the old, as Paul was. So if you want, it's in Paul's context. It was necessary because he had to play with the old and the new together. But if you just want to get rid of the old, as Marx wanted, then it's a different story.
Then you can be coherent.
You can be more coherent, yes, definitely.
This brings up an interesting point. I've heard Philo was arguing with other Jews that were Hellenistic. However, they were extreme. And they were saying Torah is all about it, the real meaning is spiritual. So they started to say, look, you don't have to practice circumcision. You don't have to practice the Torah. You don't have to eat kosher. Those things are pointing to spiritual things. And I think 1 Enoch hints at some of the thinking kind of behind spiritualizing Torah. Paul does something like this too. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this, because he in 1 Corinthians 9 is arguing with the Corinthian church for him and Barnabas. And he's saying, look, we can't get paid, but these guys can get paid. Not that I want any of your money, but, like he's arguing with them. And then he says, it is written, and you shall not, muzzle your oxen while it's working in the field. And he says, does God care about oxen? No, it's talking about us. And now that is radical, because that tells us his cards. He's showing his cards and he's saying, look, I will use any of the scriptures and use a pesher to spiritualize or give it my own meaning for what I need done right now with my context. And I just say that to say, is Paul like what Philo's arguing against? Because Paul seems very spiritualizing of things. Extreme.
Not really. You picked one of the only verses when he does that,
right.
And that's a really, that's a verse that the rabbis struggled with also. And actually, this specific question, does God, really care about oxen, is a question that the Midrash, ask also. But he doesn't do it in any systematic way. Look, he doesn't allegorize the issue of, food purity, and he could say in Galatians 2, you can eat with the Gentiles, because the whole issue of kosher and non-kosher food is an allegory. He doesn't do that, right?
Right.
He doesn't do that with the holidays. He doesn't say we know that Christians will do that in the 2nd century, that Justin Martyr does that with all the commandments, right? Read them allegorically. So with the Shabbat, and with everything. But Paul does not do that, because he's an apostle to the ethnic. And so for him, Jews, continue to keep the commandments. And maybe he personally did, we don't know, but, he might as well. But his mission is to let these Gentiles in. So he's not, and he was not educated in Alexandria. He was educated in Jerusalem. He's not part of this story that Philo is struggling against. So no, I think we will miss the the chord if we see him as just a kind of spiritualizing allegorist. We maybe have hints that that he learned from his Greek teachers or whatever, but that's not his mission, and he certainly does not do it in any systematic way.
Wow.
Although he could, and that might might make life easier for him.
It's too vague to try and he doesn't say enough for you to draw those conclusions. So that's a good point, because just because he's arguing against Cephas, or Peter, if you'd like to call him Cephas, he's arguing with him. You're a hypocrite. He could have at that moment said, this doesn't even matter, and you're making it matter. But he doesn't say that either. So that's a good point. Adi, I know you got to go soon, and I only have a few more points, but do you have to go ahead and go now?
I would like to say goodbye, but before I say goodbye, I would like to say just one point. Maybe you can continue with this later. Okay. I said before, I emphasized before the transitional status of Gentile as a concept, as a status. So it was introduced in order to allow the growth of and its effect, not in order, but its effect was allowing the fast growth of the church. And once the church became hegemonic, it didn't need it anymore. But at precisely the same time, it became one of the most constitutive concepts for the rabbinic Jews. They took, well, not literally took, but they used the same abstraction, the same opposition that Paul drew, and they said, yes, we are Israel, you are the Gentiles. And from there they continued to build an entire system of halakhic law based on the exclusion of the Gentile from the law in various meanings of exclusion, various ways of exclusion that I will leave Ishay to to explore, because I'm sorry I have to go.
No
but
problem.
I think that the difference between the temporary function of the concept for Paul and the long-term functionality of this term for rabbinic Judaism could not be more emphasized.
Well, thank you so much. Let's do this again sometime. Thank you. All right. Okay. So Ishay, I don't know if okay. You want to run with that? I've got some more points, man. I've got to drive a few things with you, if you don't mind, by the way.
Hey, shoot. Let's do it fast.
So did you want to comment on what he said?
No, I think, that's a large part of our book, the rabbinic kind of conception of the Goy, because they share with Paul, this binary division, but instead of doing the next move is saying, but that doesn't really matter, they adopt it, right? As I would say the main thing that matter. They kind of, you can see it as a reaction, right?
And saying, the opposite.
Yes, this is the division, and we adhere to it. And rabbinic literature is really the first literature that we have to be built around this this distinction.
Okay.
This binary distinction, and that's what make it so, because of the centrality of rabbinic literature to the subsequent Judaisms. It's really hard to imagine a pre-Goy Jewish cultures or Judean cultures, and that's a large chunk of our effort to reconstruct these pre-Goy Judaic cultures. So when Josephus say that Herod was a hemiudaios, was a half Jew. What does he mean?
Right.
In rabbinic terms, this is meaningless. This is simply meaningless, okay? But for him, it was totally, logical to say that someone is a half Jew, okay? So we have to make sense of these cultures.
That's interesting that you say that. That kind of goes into some of what I'm going to get into here, the uncircumcision in Second Temple literature. Yeah. After the episode, we discussed via email that the rabbis innovated the idea that uncircumcised Jew is still a full-blown Jew. The rabbis believed, not a Gentile in the binary system. And Paul juxtaposes the Jews and the Gentiles with respect to circumcision. Galatians 2, verse 9, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the ethne, Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. So right there, we're going to these guys, you're going to those. You mentioned during the interview that the returnees from the Babylonian exile, per Ezra Nehemiah, saw the people of the land as non-Judeans. And you described other pre-Goy conceptions of the other as a kind of internal polemic within Israelite society at large. And most importantly, you mentioned that an uncircumcised Jew, for Josephus and Philo in particular, is not really an Israelite. And this is contrasted with the rabbis in the post-Goy period, who would never consider apostate Jews as Goyim, strictly speaking. I'd like to pull up and discuss the references you cited from the 1st century BC and 1st century AD that back this idea up, if that's okay with you. And then if you want to just comment on these and explain it, take us through it a little. So 1st Maccabees 1.
So you want me to talk about these verses?
Yeah, what's in the vein of that discussion, if you don't mind. You don't have to read them all. I think anyone can read them. They could pause the video, read it themselves, and then listen to what you say. But you have all these in your mind. I know you know these.
So listen, let me explain. There's I don't remember exactly what term I used, but maybe the exact term is not really Jews or Judeans, but not full Judeans, because we have to separate between two phenomena here, and that's, I think, will make kind of more sense if we separate two phenomena. One is the attempt to recircle the limits of what Judaism is, like Ezra and the returnees do. They say, no, only us are real Israel and the others are not. Okay, so that's one phenomena. Another phenomena is to say those, heretics are not actual Israelites. Okay, that's what 1st Maccabees do. That's what Josephus does. Now, you ask me, well, wait a minute. Are they like the Gentiles, or do they become Gentiles, right? And my answer is, this question already assumes the binary division. And so this is by definition an anachronistic question, because for them, one could be somewhere on the way, like this semi-Jew, right? That Josephus called Herod. So what they say is that, well, they're not now really, they're not really now part of us. They're not way there. They might be, on their way out. There might be already halfway out. But the thing is that there's no one, minute that you cross the border. Okay, that's a rabbinocentric, way to see. You are, you're on your way out. So that's my answer. They become gentilized, okay? And for the rabbis, now they will have to decide. You're either here or there. So large chunk of their discursive effort is to place all these categories, inside or outside. So they had to decide, right? Samaritans, are they in or out?
Good question too, by the way.
These Judaizing, figures who were not circumcised, are they in or out? But that's a new problem. That's a new problem since, from the time that the wall was, that the binary distinction was built. So if you'll ask Philo, are they real Gentiles or not real Gentiles? I'm not sure he would even follow your question. He would say, no, they're not part of us already. They're way out there.
This is interesting. This is so important. You have a different motive than me in this whole topic. And I love it because the very thing that the rabbis are doing is building a wall that Paul, or at least pseudo Paul in Ephesians, is literally breaking that wall down. And the people that I have engaged, that I'm not really engaging much anymore, except for a few of them that are really good friends, they believe that wall of separation in Ephesians 2 is actually a separation between Gentilized Israelites of the northern kingdom and Judah Jews. They interpret that through those passages.
So that's for me, Derek, part of the history of interpretation of Paul.
Right.
I don't feel a special need to refute this. Okay, fine. There's like hundreds of readings of Paul. That's one of them. Unless it becomes, of course, something that is connected to, to immoral, racist, actions. Then, we have to condemn it on the moral ground. But on interpretive ground, Paul was used to in so many contexts, and read in so many contexts. So that's another one.
Yeah. I just thought I'd throw that out there. To me, in an interpretive paradigm, it makes more sense. The binary between Israel and others, or Jew and others, makes more sense. I want to ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. And this is just...
And then I have to leave to take my Israelite children, from...
This is good.
Actual children, like actual genealogy.
Are you sure? No, I'm just kidding.
That's a good question.
I don't know. I'm just teasing. No, I definitely believe you. My question is this: the lost tribes of Israel. That's not even something that you guys deal with in your book. Your book's not about that. But do you agree that they? Do you think that the lost tribes of Israel motif is a mythological motif that isn't literally true, like in the literal sense, but it's a faith thing that Josephus has?
Yeah. Look, according to the Bible, the Israelites, the 10 tribes, were exiled, right? That's probably history. And then what happened? Probably what happened is what happened to other peoples that were exiled to Assyria, meaning they were mixed with the others and assimilated. But the prophets, right, use it as a recurring theme of, the expected return. From that moment on, it became from a simple historical fact into a myth. A myth not in the sense that it's a simple lie. A myth in the sense that it's something that a community tells itself, right, in order to kind of create a cohesive, right, a kind of glue, right? So when Jeremiah says, and the lost tribes will return, right, and they will become one, right? Or when Ezekiel speak about, probably these tribes were already gone. They were already part of but for them and for these prophets and for their community, this was a very powerful idea. So I take it as a history of ideas, right? The idea of the 10 tribes as something that, that the prophets talk about, that the rabbis talk about, as part of their vision of the right, of the eschatology, etc. So for me, these groups that you speak about are part of this history of, right, of interpretation and reinterpretation and reusage of this idea to create self-identity. That's what communities do. They use, ancient ideas to create self-identity.
Wow. That was well said. I need to get more of your books, and that's the only way I'm going to get you back on the show. I feel like the only way I'm going to get you back on is we have exhausted this book. We really could get into the rabbis more, but I want to read some of your other books because I think it'll overlap some of what you write in this book, and I would like to learn more from you because you are well aware of things I'll never be aware of. So
it's a pleasure. To be continued. To be
continued. Ladies and gentlemen, do not forget, go down in the description, get the book, ebook, get it paperback. If you got money, get you a hardback version. I really recommend you guys get on the same page because this is scholarship for you, man. This is amazing. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And don't forget, we are MythVision Israelites. No, I'm just kidding.